Hey y'all, welcome back to Planet J, where we discuss all things astrology, tarot, divination, and spirituality. Today's video is on Uranus entering Gemini on May 25th, around 4:48 p.m. Eastern Standard Time and 8:48 UTC time. So what's the astro energy and what advice can I give each and every rising sign during this transit? It takes 84 years for Uranus to go through a full cycle, and Uranus has not been in Gemini since the 1940s. We all know that was a very tumultuous time for many reasons. So I'm going to break down Uranus conceptually, and I'm also going to break it down for each rising sign. So if you're interested in figuring out what these next years are going to be like for you, keep listening. Uranus is the planet of disruption, innovation, and forced change. It breaks patterns that have become too comfortable or outdated and replaces them with something faster, usually more efficient, or just better aligned with independence. Uranus is interesting because it does not ask for permission. It creates sudden shifts in behavior, systems, and environments that push people to adapt in real time. Over the years, Uranus transits don't just change situations, they change how people think, respond, and make decisions at a core level. Uranus transits do not feel calm or gradual. They feel disruptive, fast, and sometimes uncomfortable, which is why you're going to be seeing a lot of posts talking about Uranus and Gemini, and it might come off a bit like fear-mongering, or every transit people bring up, there's always some downside to it, but that's really not the case. Uranus is interesting because people often experience these transits as periods where things stop working the way they used to. There's this pressure to figure something out and quickly. So it can feel like your routine is constantly being interrupted. Your plans change suddenly, or you're being pushed into decisions that you are not fully prepared for. Now, this is also a mental component, or there's also a mental component there, where people feel restless, easily bored, or even unable to tolerate stagnation when they're experiencing Uranus transits. While at the same time, Uranus can feel exciting because it opens doors that did not exist before. Imagine a portal just appearing right in front of you, taking you where you need to go to evolve or to help your community or society evolve as well. So, it can create breakthroughs, but those breakthroughs, again, they usually come after some sort of instability. For example, with Uranus and Taurus from 2018 up until now, 2026, the focus was on survival, money, resources, and stability. We saw this play out through real-world events like COVID-19's pandemic disrupting jobs, income, supply chain issues, inflation, and people became more conscious about what they were consuming and how to sustain themselves. There was a rise in conversations around food security, environmental damage, overconsumption, and the need to become more self-reliant. Even trends like remote work, side hustles, and people leaving their traditional jobs reflect Uranus forcing change and how people earn and maintain stability. The last time Uranus was in Gemini was from 1941 to 1949, and the societal shifts reflected classic Uranus themes in a Gemini area. So this was World War II, an immediate aftermath where communication, information, and technology rapidly evolved. There was a massive rise in radio broadcasting, especially in the United States, by our own presidents. Coded communication, propaganda, and information control rose. The development of early computers began during this time as well, and intelligence systems became more advanced. People had to adapt quickly to new information coming in from different angles, different places, different forms of media. That meant changing narratives and fast-moving global events. So the way information was shared directly impacted public perception, morale, and decision-making on a global scale. So comparing that to now, we are entering a similar theme, but at a much more advanced level. Instead of radio and print, we're dealing with AI, social media, digital identity, and real-time global communication. The same themes of information control, propaganda, and rapid technological advancement are already visible, but now they're moving faster and reaching much farther. Debates around free speech, censorship, misinformation, data privacy mirror past concerns, but in a digital space. Just like back then, people will need to learn how to think more critically, adapt to changing information, and navigate a world where communication itself is constantly evolving. So, Uranus moves into Gemini, and the focus shifts from physical survival to mental, social, and informational survival. Uranus is not just chaos for the sake of chaos, it's disruption with a purpose. So this will show up through rapid changes in communication, media, technology, and how people really connect with one another. Real-life examples are already building, such as the explosion of AI, concerns around data privacy, misinformation, censorship debates, and shifts in social media platforms. You may also see changes in educational systems, digital communication outages, new platforms replacing the old ones, and more people building independent voices through writing, content, or online businesses. Human rights efforts may center more around free speech, access to information without it being tainted, digital identity, as well as technological ethics, which isn't a conversation that they were having to have in the 1940s, but over those years, while we're right back at the Uranus and Gemini transit, but through those years that it took to go through that full cycle, we did see technology picking up. And now when it's got back to Gemini, this is representing a moment where something has stopped working the way it used to. And instead of slowly fixing it, it's breaking it open completely. That's what Uranus does. This is why people associate Uranus with shock, rebellion, and unpredictability. But that is only one side to it. The other side is innovation, it's independence and progress. Uranus is what pushes society forward when it has outgrown its current systems. A good way to understand Uranus is through the myth of Prometheus. Prometheus is known for stealing fire from the gods and giving it to humanity. That act was both rebellious, disruptive, and it went against the established authority. But it also advanced human life permanently. That is Uranus. It breaks rules, not just to destroy them, but to introduce something that changes how people live. Now, when people say Uranus is in fall in Taurus, which is, the Uranus season we're just now coming out of, or we're about to come out of at the end of May, approximately around 4:48 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the 25th. So when it's in Taurus, quote unquote, in fall, they're trying to apply the traditional planetary rules to something that doesn't behave traditionally, and that's why it can get a bit confusing. Outer planets do not operate like personal planets. Uranus does not, quote unquote, struggle in Taurus in a simple way. What actually happens is tension. So Taurus is fixed, it's slow, stable, and focused on security, resources, and the material world. Now Uranus is the opposite of that, it's fast, it's disruptive, and it's focused on the future. So in Taurus, what does this mean? It means that change was not happening smoothly. It's building pressure over time, kind of like a pressure cooker, and then it releases it in bursts. So this is exactly what we saw from 2018 up until now. I'm sure each and every one of us can remember looking in the news, listening to the radio, or seeing videos of certain things surrounding Taurus and Uranian concept from 2018 up until this year. Now, instead of constant visible chaos, because it was in Taurus, what we saw was long periods of pressure, followed by major disruptions. Real-life examples are clear. The pandemic disrupted jobs, supply chains, and basic resources, which is what Taurus is all about. Now, in addition to this, inflation forced people to rethink spending and survival. A lot of people don't realize, but Taurus and Libra are both ruled by Venus, and Venus, to a certain extent, does control money matters. Now, we can introduce Pluto to talk about that concept when it's talking about inherited or shared money, right? Kind of like eighth house matters. But when we're talking about Uranus and Taurus, we see that inflation was forcing people to rethink spending in terms of their own survival. Like all these posts have been going on how when people used to talk about how at this age we should have kids and be married or have a more stable life, but they don't necessarily talk about how things have shifted. And that's what Uranus is. It's like shifting these things. And when it's in Taurus, it was shifting these things slowly over time. But you're starting to see more and more conversations about how resources, basic resources at that, getting food at the store, being able to fill your car with gas to get to and from work or take your kids where they need to go. It's getting harder and harder for people to do that, right? And so there was this massive shift in how people valued work as well for that very reason, with more people leaving traditional jobs, building independent income streams after seeing the world go into chaos after a big pandemic like that. You know, conversations around food quality, environmental damage, overconsumption, and self sustainability became more mainstream. And even culturally, people started questioning what security actually meant and what it means. Is it a stable job? Or is it adaptability? Is it owning more assets or needing less and living more minimally? That is Uranus and Taurus, and that's what we were experiencing from 2018 up until now. It exposed how unstable, quote unquote, stability actually was. And now Uranus moving into Gemini shifts the focus completely. We are moving from physical survival into mental and informational survival. What does that mean? Well, Gemini is fast, curious, and communicative, constantly changing. And Uranus here does not build pressure slowly like Taurus because those two elements, that describe Gemini, fast, communicative, kind of mesh a little bit more with Uranus. So instead of seeing that pressure cooker or, things slowly building up like it did in Taurus while it was in fall, now it's moving quickly. Changes happen more frequently as well, more visibly and mentally, meaning we're thinking about it, right? And it's coming through in the way we communicate. So this is where we start to see rapid shifts in that communication via media and technology. You're already seeing the beginning of this with AI, debates around censorship, misinformation, digital identity, as well as data privacy, and the dangers around AI as well, and how we're having conversations about that because we now know a little bit more about technology as compared to when Uranus was in Gemini back in 1940, 84, almost years ago, right? So there's also a rise in independent platforms, people creating their own spaces online. Apps are rising all of a sudden, dating apps, apps to make friends, apps to sell stuff, right? So there's this rise again in those independent platforms, people creating their own spaces. And then there's this shift away from relying on these centralized systems to communicate and share ideas because we now know the world is our oyster when it comes to stuff like that. That's Uranus and Gemini. So this is also where human rights conversations evolve. But how do they evolve? It's less about the physical resources and that's the Taurus energy, right? Now we're talking more about access to information, freedom of speech, control over personal data and identity, Gemini, right? So historically, the last time Uranus was in Gemini from 1941 to 1949, the world experienced rapid developments in communication and those information systems during World War II. Radio broadcasting expanded, coded messaging became critical, and early computing systems were developed. So information itself became a tool of power that not just normal everyday people were using, but people that were running entire systems of government in entire countries, right? And again, these are all countries that had different political systems too. So the conversations about, data privacy, misinformation, they're all different depending on where you are. So there's the cultural aspect of it, right? But let's dive deeper into that conversation about information becoming a tool of power. Propaganda, messaging, and perception directly influenced outcomes on a global scale at this time from 1941 to 1949. Now we're entering the same theme again, but at a much more advanced level because we have so much more different platforms, communication systems, technology. It's just different. So instead of radio, we have social media. Instead of a president back then communicating about the war and trying to make people more focused on being a patriot, at least in the United States, now we're seeing TikTok. Now we're seeing different social media apps, and being able to shop in those apps, and expand your community in those apps and stuff too. So it's a different type of power, especially if you consider, people that may live in more rural areas or areas that are going through political conflict, um, war. It's just crazy. So we're entering that theme again, but at a more advanced level. We have encryption, we have AI, we have data systems, we have messages that vanish as soon as you send them. It's or after 24 hours. But that's just one expression, right? What often gets ignored is that Uranus is also responsible for breakthroughs, advancements in AI, improvements in communication technology, innovations in education, new ways of learning new languages like Rosetta Zone, Duolingo, stuff like that, developments in transportation, even discoveries through space technology are aligned with this energy. So while we are going to see, talk about AI, talk about technology and stuff, it's also going to be on a completely different scale, right? Uranus and Gemini can bring major intellectual and technological breakthroughs that change everyday life. So think about it like this. Uranus represents invention, and Gemini represents intelligence and information. Artificial intelligence is literally the combination of both invention, intelligence, and information, right? So there's also a larger societal pattern happening alongside this transit. As mentioned in earlier astrological predictions about Pluto's time in Capricorn, there has been a tightening of control, increased regulation, and a stronger divide in how people define concepts like loyalty, truth, and authority. Words like patriotism and treason have become subjective depending on perspective. And that tension does not just disappear. Uranus in Gemini challenges it by disrupting how those narratives are being communicated and understood. People begin questioning what they're told. They start comparing sources. They're communicating more. They're organizing more quickly. And once we see Uranus move into Virgo, which is the organization of information, if Gemini is receiving the information, Virgo will be organizing it. So we'll see really big changes, and I can't wait to see all the predictions for that. But let's stick to and focus on Uranus and Gemini, because I don't want to confuse anybody here that is, just getting into astrology or just now starting to apply these outer planet transits to their everyday life. So Uranus and Gemini is challenging that, subjective perspective by disrupting how those narratives are being communicated. Because people are now questioning what they're being told and comparing these sources, it allows them to organize the information more quickly, but it also allows them to spread information faster than control can really keep up with it. Now, this is why fear-based content around this transit is actually misleading or a bit incomplete. Because yes, Uranus brings disruption. Yes, it can feel chaotic, but it is not one-sided. Uranus and Taurus showed people that the systems they depended on were not as stable as they thought. Uranus and Gemini will show people that the information they depend on is not as reliable as they think. And more importantly, it will push people to develop their own way of thinking, communicating, and understanding the world, snapping us out of the focus on the materialistic, right? I mean, we also saw the rise of influencers. We also saw the rise of affiliate marketing and things like that. And it's not all bad, right? Creating a more stable version of life for yourself, whether that is opening up a new business, networking with people that already have them, whatever it is, that's not necessarily wrong. But this transit is not just about what changes around you. It's about how you adapt mentally, how you process information, and how you choose to engage with a world that is constantly evolving. The people who do well in this transit are not ones who try to control everything. They're the ones who learn to think for themselves while everything around them is changing. Thanks for listening. If you want to get the breakdown based on your rising sign, continue listening. Check out the post for your specific rising sign on Patreon, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.